In the first half of this essay, I explored how DCTV got Clark Kent right, how it balanced his identity as a hero and a husband and a father. But something else struck me as I dug deeper into Glenn Weldon's Superman the Unauthorized biography while filming and editing, and that's how both Smallville and Superman and Lois are in conversation with Superman's comic book origins, and interestingly, how differently they are. Smallville reflects the post-crisis comics, emphasizing a grounded, more modern journey towards heroism. Meanwhile, Superman and Lois draws on the Golden Age, where Superman was a social crusader fighting for the helpless. Together, these shows represent two distinct but very modern phases of Superman's evolution. Side note, if you're a Superman fan or just curious about what makes him such an iconic character, this book is a must-read. It dives into every era of Superman's history in a digestible manner, and Weldon mixes his sharp insights with fascinating behind-the-scenes stories, all while showing how Superman has always reflected the world around him. Whether you love Smallville, Superman and Lois, or just want to know more detailed info on the character after this video, I think it's definitely worth picking up. Smallville premiered in 2001, at a time where Superman was still heavily influenced by the post-crisis reboot of the 1980s. After Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC Comics redefined Superman's origin story to make it more grounded and relatable. This is where John Byrne's Man of Steel miniseries scrapped the idea of a teenage Superboy flying around Smallville and instead gave us a Clark Kent whose powers developed gradually over time. He wasn't born a hero, he had to grow into one. In Smallville, you see that same gradual progression. Clark doesn't start out with all the answers. He's impulsive, insecure, and still figuring out who he wants to be. And like Byrne's version, it's Jonathan Kent who becomes his moral compass, teaching Clark to think beyond himself. One of the most memorable scenes in Smallville's early seasons is Jonathan showing Clark his spaceship and saying, essentially, with these great powers, you have a great responsibility, which, by the way, is a quote that finds its comic book origins in 1945 Bill Finger Superman. Look it up.
Because of these great powers, you have a great responsibility.
Smallville largely leans into the post-crisis approach to character complexity, especially with Lex Luthor. In the comics, Siegel's 1960s retcon revealed that Lex and Superboy were childhood acquaintances in Smallville. But the show takes this even further, turning Lex and Clark's friendship into one of the show's central dynamics. Lex isn't a cartoonish villain. He's a deeply flawed character whose descent into darkness feels inevitable, but also tragic. It's a perfect reflection of the post-crisis focus on making villains more modern and their motivations more personal. And then there's Clark's departure from Smallville to embrace his destiny, another Byrne staple. Unlike the pre-crisis Superboy, who was essentially Superman in training, this Clark doesn't take on the Superman mantle until he's fully ready. Smallville stretches that journey over 10 seasons, making it feel earned and deeply personal. It's not about flights and tights. It's about growth, responsibility, and finding your place in the world. But for Superman and Lois, let's start at the beginning. Siegel and Schuster's original Superman was a fighter for the oppressed. Based on Pulp Fiction characters like Zorro, he was a fantastical guy who was written to tackle real-world issues head-on. He stopped corrupt businessmen, smashed through the slums to make ways for better housing, and literally slammed abusive husbands into walls to teach them a lesson. This version of Superman was bold, direct, and socially conscious. He wasn't just a superhero, he was a social crusader. And that's exactly the energy that Superman and Lois captures. The show's Clark Kent isn't saving Smallville from cartoon villains. He's up against real challenges. The town is struggling economically. People are losing their jobs and falling into debt, all because of a corporation that doesn't care about them. Clark's fight against Morgan Edge might involve Kryptonian tech and sci-fi twists, but at its heart, it's about standing up for his community, just like Superman did in the 1930s. This idea of Superman fighting for the little guy didn't just stop in the comics. The Superman radio show in the 1940s took it even further. At one point, they had Superman take on the Ku Klux Klan, using real Klan code words and exposing their secrets to the public. It wasn't just entertainment, it was activism. The show turned Superman into a champion of equal rights and someone who fought prejudice and hatred. In Superman and Lois, we see echoes of that same activism. both in the ending of its narrative and in how Lois's journalism is at the center of the story. She's exposing corruption, standing up for the truth, and refusing to back down, even when it costs her personally. Clark and Lois aren't just fighting villains. They're tackling issues that feel grounded and real. It's a nod to the socially conscious Superman stories of the past, but utilizing the strength and iconography that fans are intimately familiar with today. And that's where Superman and Lois really shines. It doesn't just stop at being a throwback to the Golden Age. It's also a deeply postmodern take on Superman's legacy. Over the decades, Superman stories started exploring his humanity more deeply. In Silver Age stories, we saw emotional, melodramatic, domestic storylines. And in post-crisis stories, like Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which is the story that originates the namesakes for the Kent sons, and Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman, the character became a symbol of something even bigger, the weight of being a hero, eventually returning to a powerful political icon in stories like David Goyer's The Incident, which features a monologue so cold from Clark, I'm just gonna flash it here. Superman and Lois took these ideas and ran with it. The show asks, what does it mean to be Superman when you're not just saving the world, but raising kids who will follow in your footsteps? Clark is constantly torn between being a global icon and being a good dad. He has to guide his sons, especially Jordan, who's coming into his powers, while dealing with the fear that they might inherit his burdens as well. It's not just about truth and justice. It's about legacy, responsibility, and what you leave behind. At its core, Superman and Lois feels like a love letter to everything Superman has been. It's modern and self-aware, but it never forgets where it all started. From the Golden Age's focus on fighting for the little guy to the iconography of the post-crisis era, these shows thread these influences into something fresh. It's not just asking who Superman is today, it's showing us who he's always been. It doesn't need to reinvent Superman, but it reminds us why he mattered in the first place. And then there's James Gunn's upcoming Superman film, which has just got a new trailer at the time of recording, which offers a fascinating new perspective. In interviews, Gunn said he doesn't see Clark or Superman as their real identity. Instead, he sees them as two halves of the same person, which, as we discussed last time, is great to hear, as the best Superman stories understand this balance. It's not about choosing between the alien and the human. It's about how they coexist. Gunn is also taking us to a thus far unexplored era of Superman comics in his embrace of the Silver Age whimsy. This is also fascinating to hear because not all projects about this character need to have such sprawling conversations about Superman's history or be deconstructionist approaches to myth-making, as others have done to compelling extents in the past. In fact, all it needs to do is simply understand what makes Superman important to people, and it needs to inspire them to be hopeful, to be kind, to be strong. And judging about what the creative team has to say about his costume and what he represents, as well as the imagery in the trailer and people's reactions all around the world, I think we're in good hands. Also, can I rave about how fucking sick this movie looks? The Leica trifocal lens looks fucking insane on the large format sensor, and I think we should take a moment to applaud a modern blockbuster that actually has a distinct color grade and production design. Also, crypto rules. Need I say more?